Today I am bringing you my March reading wrap up. We are going to be talking about the 7 books that I read in March. If you keep seeing me look down, it's because I've started putting my laptop in front of the camera down here so that I can easily read stuff while I'm talking to you. The only thing I actually have open right now is my reading spreadsheet. I haven't made notes for this wrap up. I'm filming it a little bit spontaneously because it occurred to me if I don't film it today, then I don't know when I'm going to have time to film it before the end of the week. So we're going to talk about the 7 books that I read this month, and this month I'm going to go in order of when I finished the books rather than like the last few months I've been going in order of star rating. But there were no books that really stood out to me this month as books that I hated or books that I particularly loved. It was a very mid-month, however I feel like I still have quite a bit to say about some of these books. So we're going to kick things off with Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. This book I don't think I've talked about yet in a video. It's the only book that I've read by Grady Hendrix, so I have nothing else to compare it to. I have been curious about Grady Hendrix for a while because I know that he's a very popular horror author. I have been unsure whether his books are for me because I've heard people describe his books as campy horror, and while I like that in movies, I don't think I like it in books. So even though some of his concepts sound really interesting, I've put off reading any of his books until now. This came out a couple of months ago and I heard some early reviews saying that it's a very different tone to some of his other books, which made me think, okay, maybe I have a good chance of liking this more than some of his other books, so it would be a good place to start. I gave this one a 3.5 stars, however I rounded up on Goodreads because I really appreciated how this was shining a light on something that really happened in history. It's a blend between historical and horror, I would say. It also made me more emotional than I was expecting, so there was a lot about this that I liked. I also have some issues with it. So this is following a teenage girl called Neva, I think is her real name, but for most of the book she goes by Fern, and the book opens with her being driven by her dad to this home for young, unwed, pregnant teenagers, and there are quite a few girls who are living in this home. They're expected to have their babies in private. Those babies are adopted away, and then the girls are expected to go back to their everyday life and pretend that nothing happened. The beginning of the book is kind of setting the scene and introducing all of these different characters. All of these girls have different backstories, and I actually felt like Fern was the least interesting character in comparison to there's 3 main girls that she interacts with. Where the witchy element comes in is they are given this book about witchcraft and they start experimenting with magic, and I think that the witchy element, so it was my least favourite thing about the book. I felt like it went too far, there was too much, and in particular there was too much outside of the home. I wanted the story to be focused on these girls, and it was, but there was also this cartoonish villain character which I didn't like. I felt like some of the witchy elements were too cheesy and therefore didn't really fit in with the otherwise very serious tone of the book and how it was shining a light on something that happened to so many women. Not just in the US, it happened all over the world. I know that it definitely happened in the UK. I don't think this book needed to be over 500 pages. I think it could have easily been 400 pages and it would have been a lot stronger. I wanted it to focus on the real horror of the situation. There's a lot of graphic birth scenes, and I think if you have any triggers relating to pregnancy, then you're probably going to want to skip this book. It brought out a lot of strong emotions in me. I felt angry and frustrated about how these girls weren't told anything. They weren't fully prepared for what was going to happen to them, and it was like really heartbreaking in places. I think ultimately I wanted it to focus more on the historical, and the horror, like witchy element, for me was just not as interesting. I also wouldn't recommend the audiobook for this. I listened to it on audio because I was away in Venice, and the only reason I continued with the audiobook is because I didn't have anything else downloaded to listen to offline, so it was kind of all I had. So I continued listening to the audiobook even though I kind of knew from the first few chapters that it wasn't my favourite narration style. The main narrator has a very expressive voice. On the one hand, it did keep me engaged, like I was definitely listening to the book. I really don't want to be mean, but it sounded like they were overacting and I found that quite jarring. There's also parts where there's chanting and where there's people casting spells, and those parts were just not the nicest to listen to. So I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend the audiobook. However, I would recommend this this book as a whole. I think as long as you're prepared for what you're getting, it is worth reading. The next book that I picked up was a sequel, and that was Cursebound by Sarah L. Arifi. This is the second book in the Feybound series. Feybound is the name of the first book. I don't know whether the series is called Feybound, but this is the second book in a series. I liked the first book. I had some issues with it. However, I was hoping that those issues would disappear as I got into the series, and it's so frustrating because I think the series has so much potential. I feel like it's been a bit rushed, especially the sequel. There was something about the pacing that just felt really off to me. In this series, we're following two elven sisters who discover that the elves are not actually alone in this world, and they become entangled within the Fey politics. And there's also this never-ending war between the elves, and there's a lot of moving elements that I really appreciated. I like how much effort and thought has gone into developing the lore and the history of this world. The first book is marketed as a romantasy, and I can understand that because there is a significant focus on the romantic elements. Each sister has a different romantic plotline. I think the series would have been stronger if this had instead been two interconnected duologies, if we'd had two books focusing on the older sister and her romance, and we could have had a separate duology focusing on the younger sister. And I think that maybe would have helped me feel more invested in these romances, because I just don't really feel it, especially like the younger sister I think is really annoying. The second book also has a mystery plot line, which I felt took up too much of the book. I just wasn't that interested in it. I think for me, what I like most about this series is the world and how Sarah Al Arifi is actually really good at writing plot twists. I think she's very good at describing a world and making you feel immersed in it. It's the characters that I'm struggling with, so I probably will read the third and final book. I think this is going to be a trilogy. I will read it when it comes out. Hopefully it'll come out next year, because I think if I were to wait too long in between books, then details would disappear from my memory. It is really frustrating when you feel like you should love a series and instead you're finding it just okay. The next book on my list is Hope Street by Mike Gale. This is another new release. I think I might have actually had an arc of this through NetGalley. I'll double check, but I'm pretty sure the next few books I read arcs, so advanced copies that I got through NetGalley. I've read quite a few Mike Gale books and have really enjoyed them. I don't think I've given any of these books less than a 4 stars. This was also a 4 stars. It's not my favourite by him. However, I like how he writes these stories about everyday people. This is set in Derby in the East Midlands, and we are following two characters. The first is a journalist. I want to say her name is Lila. Might have got that wrong, but we're following this main character who's a journalist, and she is tasked with writing a story about this place called Hope Street, which is a street that the council have gradually moved people out of because their plan is to flatten it and build a new development there. The problem is that one guy is refusing to leave, and he's the only resident left on this street. The guy in question is called Connor, and the reason why he is refusing to leave is because several years ago his mom went out one day and never came home, and he's convinced that one day she's going to come back to him. So the book goes from there. Connor ends up asking Lila if she will help him investigate what happened to his mom, and it's very slice of life. You're following these characters as they go about their everyday lives. You're seeing them develop new relationships, and you're also seeing this mystery unfold of what happened to Connor's mom. You do also get flashbacks to her perspective in the past. So I gave this one 4 stars. I really like how Mike Gale has this very easy to read writing style. There's something about his books that make them feel very easy and breezy, but they're still delving into these emotional topics, and this did make me cry a little bit at one point. The only thing that I didn't love was the main character's relationship drama. I've noticed with a few of his more recent books that they do tend to have a main character who has some sort of relationship drama, and I just don't find it that interesting. I don't think he's very good at writing romance personally, so I would prefer it if his books just focused on family relationships or friendships. I think that's where he really shines. So 4 stars, would recommend it. It does feel very British, so bear that in mind if you are thinking about picking it up. I wouldn't necessarily say that you couldn't read this if you're outside the UK. However, I think it does feel like nostalgic in that sense, or at least it did for me. Next up I read Making a Killing by Cara Hunter, which is the most recent release in the D.I. Adam Fawley series. This is one of my favourite crime thriller series. It's set in Oxford and it follows a team of detectives who are investigating different crimes. So usually I would say that you can read each book as a standalone because it's a different crime that they're investigating. However, in this book, we're coming full circle and the crime, the case that they're investigating relates to the case of a missing girl, which is the case that they were investigating in the first book. So conceptually, I thought this sounded so intriguing. All of the books in this series so far I've given 4 or 5 stars. However, I gave this one a 3. I really liked the second half. However, the first half I actually found really tedious to get through. I think it's because there are going to be people reading this book who haven't read the first book, and that's understandable. So the author obviously had to catch everyone up to make sure everyone was on the same page. As someone who has read the first book though, I felt like I was just waiting for the characters to find out information that I already knew. This book is also set several years after the end of the previous book, and the characters have now dispersed and moved on to different areas. So there was also a lot of getting everyone back together to make them be in a position where they could investigate this case, and I don't think that was necessary. I felt like we were wasting so much time to get to the point of the story, and once we actually got into it, I found it was pretty good. The first half I would say was a 2 stars, the second half was a 4, so I averaged out at a 3. I'm glad that I read it because I do still really like this series. This one was just not my favourite instalment, unfortunately. Ultimately, I'm reading these books for the plot, not the characters, and I felt like the first half concentrated too much on the characters. Next up I read Burn After Reading by Catherine Ryan Howard, which I gave 4 stars, I think. I was torn between a 4 and a 5, however, on reflection, it's more like a 4. I don't think I liked it as much as some of her other books. However, I did really enjoy this. The concept sounded so intriguing, and I think it did deliver. It just didn't have the strongest ending. So basic synopsis for this, we're following a main character who is a writer, and she is tasked with writing a book, ghostwriting a book for a guy who has been accused of killing his wife. So his wife passed away the year before in a fire at their home. He initially was labelled a hero because he wasn't home at the time, but when he got there, he ran into this burning building, carried her out, and claimed that she died in his arms. It turns out that she was actually dead before the fire was started, and so immediately people decided that he's a murderer. It must have been him. It's always the husband. He is determined to tell his side of the story, and so our main character is hired by the publisher to ghostwrite his book. I love how Catherine Ryan Howard does a slow build up. There are parts of this that are quite slow. However, there's this simmering tension the whole way through. And while I don't think the ending fully delivered, I do think that it was a satisfying enough ending that it warranted that slow build up. There's also discussions around morality in the publishing industry. The main character feels like she has no choice but to take this job, and the whole time she's questioning like whether it's the right decision, because if this guy turns out to be guilty, then she's helping and contributing to giving him a platform. This is only being published in the UK and Ireland from what I understand. I know it's not being published in the US and Canada. However, if you aren't able to get hold of a copy in your country, I know that there are some UK booksellers who ship internationally, including Blackwell's, so would recommend looking into that if you are curious about this book. I actually enjoyed Burn After Reading so much that it reminded me that I still have quite a few Catherine Ryan Howard backlist books that I need to try out, so I then decided to pick up The Liar's Girl by Catherine Ryan Howard. This is one of her older titles. I think it came out in 2018. The first book that I read from her was The Nothing Man, and I think that came out in 2020, so this is quite a few years old now, and the synopsis, the title and the front cover make it seem like it's just another generic psychological thriller. I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I think that while it doesn't do anything super unique, it is very well written. So in this, we're following a main character who now lives in the Netherlands. However, when she was a teenager, she's 30 now, when she was in college, she was dating this guy who was later convicted of being a serial killer, and she's clearly not been able to move past what happened. In the present day, a copycat killer seems to be murdering women in the same way, and her ex, who's now currently in a psychiatric facility, he turns around and says that he has information that may be helpful, but the only person he'll talk to is our main character. So she travels back to Ireland to help with the investigation, and you spend a lot of time in her mind seeing her thoughts. There's also flashbacks to 10 years ago when she was at college, and I loved the past chapters. It felt so nostalgic because it was set around, I think, 2007 or 2008. It was around the same time that I was going off to uni, and there's just little references that took me back to that time and how it felt being away from home for the first time and living independently. It is quite slow in places, and it's not really an action thriller, but there are some great moments of tension, and I thought the ending was satisfying. It's not my favourite ending to a thriller ever, but I thought that it wrapped things up in a way that did feel satisfying. The final book on my list is Empire of Storms by Sarah J Maas, which is, I think, book 6 in the Throne of Glass series. I always get confused because I never know whether to consider Assassin's Blade as book 1 when it's technically, well, it is not even technically, it's a short story collection that you can read at any point. The point is, I only have 2 more books left to go in this series, and Empire of Storms wasn't my favourite. I gave it 4 stars. I really love some of the side characters in this, and there are relationships developing that I'm really invested in. I don't like the main character though. I think some of her decisions in this, to me, made no sense. Maybe that's a little harsh, but I didn't like some of the decisions that were made in this book. And also there's one particular romantic pairing which I don't understand. I feel like there's one character whose personality has completely changed, and the lack of consistency annoyed me. So this was okay. It was a good installment. It wasn't really a book progressing the plot. It was more about developing the characters and these relationships, and I enjoyed some of it, but not all of it. I'm really curious to read the last 2 books though and see how everything wraps up. I'm hoping to read both of them in April. That does bring me to the end of this wrap up, so thank you for watching. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments if you have read any of these books, and if you have any thoughts or feelings on them, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye.